thinking about the French marshals. I remember one of them saying to me when I said, "Well, we want to catch up with the group," and he said, "Can you run with your pizza?" This time at the Roman Forum, I have not had the misfortune of following Dr. Rayo. That fell to Mike, and I'm confident that you had lunch and a couple of glasses of wine, and the memory of John's brilliance is already fading from your mind, and this comforts me greatly. But my topic, Uncle Tom's Catholics Selling Out the Church to Americanism, involves a discussion of Americanism, and of course I'm going to have to tell you at some point in this talk what Americanism is. One thing it isn't is the phantom heresy we hear it so often described as. It's a real flesh and blood heresy with a lot of bones and meat that can be discussed. But in order to understand what it is, I think we have to go a little bit deeper than the important observation that it is a direct attack on the social kingship doctrine. That it is, and that's the greatest evil about it. My emphasis is going to be getting at the philosophical underpinnings of Americanism. What is it at the philosophical level? And what it is at the philosophical level is nothing short of the incarnation of liberalism, held up as an idol. And what do I mean by liberalism? I mean an attack not just on the Church's teaching on the proper constitution of society, political society specifically, but an attack on reason itself, and an attack on the very nature of man as a unity of body and soul. And even the popes realized that this was an attack on a rational construction of social life. Leo himself said the very pagans understood the way society has to be organized. And Leo said that the social kingship teaching is confirmed, and I believe I'm quoting verbatim, confirmed by the highest principles of natural reason itself. He was referring back to the Greeks and their insights into the constitution of political society. And as John said in his talk, life is holistic. The Greeks understood this on a purely natural level. Man is a unity of body and soul. They understood who God was. They paid lip service to polytheism. Socrates mocked polytheism and paid for it with his life. I remember my roommate and I used to have a little pageant in our room back at Fordham. He'd come in a white toga, and he would say, "I don't know corrupt them with the youth." And he would say, in response to the choice given to Socrates, "I'll take a Thessaly." He paid for his life with the crime of acknowledging the insight of reason itself to what God is. And the Greeks understood that God is the summum bonum, the summation of all perfections, the standard by which man is measured. God contains all perfections within himself. God is the end toward which men strive. Augustine, commenting on this, said that the Christians of his day were astonished to learn how well the Greeks understood the nature of God. He even speculated that Plato must have had some contact with the prophet Jeremiah during his wanderings in Egypt, although later on he came to the conclusion that position wasn't substantiated, and that basically the Greeks, by the operation of reason, understood who God was. And they understood what nature is all about. Everything in nature is ordained toward an end. Man is ordained toward an end. That end is God. Society is ordained toward an end, and that end is the perfection of man. Society exists for a reason. Man is born to be in society. Man is a political animal. And in society he finds his happiness. And what is happiness? The Greeks understood that happiness, because man is a unity of body and soul, is an activity of the soul, in accordance with virtue, as Aristotle said. And not only any virtue, but the best and most perfect kind of virtue. Now, they didn't know about the theological virtues, but there's the substrate for Christian life in society. That man is ordained to happiness, which consists of an activity of his soul in the perfection of virtue, and the highest of those virtues would be the greatest happiness. In other words, the theological virtues. So what is justice? The Greeks understood this too. It means giving every man his due in society toward the end that he be perfected in virtue. And they understood that, a concept of distributive and commutative justice. Commutative justice being the distribution of goods in society, and also the concept of justice between individuals in individual transactions. Commutative justice. So you had distributive justice, distribution of goods in society, and commutative justice, transactions between individuals. And the distributive justice and the commutative justice work together to create a society in which all men are led toward their perfection in virtue. They understood what the common good is. And the common good is not the sum total of individual pursuits, whatever this man wants, whatever that man wants, but the ordination of a whole of society into a moral totality in which both distributive and commutative justice work together to achieve the highest end of man. And Socrates speaks of the degenerate notion of society as a city of pigs, where people are feeding themselves out of feeding troughs, and they're having beverages and meals of various kinds, and they die fat and happy, and they derided that as the city of pigs. So the Greeks understood that man is a unity of body and soul. His final end is God. Society is ordained toward his perfection in virtue, and that perfection leads men to God. That's the correct conception of social order, understood, as Leo said, by the very pagans. And it was carried forward in Christendom, as John said in his lecture. Whether it's the Caesaral Papist model, or the national Catholic monarchical model, or even the city-states of the Italian republics, these were all Catholic moral totalities, organized according to the principle that men had a final end in God. And no matter what the particular constitution of a political society, it existed, yes, of course, for temporal ends, but ultimately to help man advance toward his final end in God. And in his recent address, the one that brought the Muslim world down on his head, this is the part no one discusses, Pope Benedict made this very point. It's actually a profound address on this very theme. He talked about the Hellenization of Christianity, which gave Christianity its decisive character. The influence of Greek thought on Christianity produced a synthesis of the two that resulted in the historically decisive character of Christianity. This is what he said in that address. This inner rapprochement between biblical faith and Greek philosophical inquiry was an event of decisive importance, not only from the standpoint of the history of religions, but also from that of world history. It is an event which concerns us even today. Given this convergence, it is not surprising that Christianity, despite its origins and some significant developments in the East, finally took on its historically decisive character in Europe. We can also express this the other way around. This convergence, with the subsequent addition of the Roman heritage that John was talking about, created Europe and remains the foundation of what rightly can be called Europe. This is the Pope saying this in the midst of 250 years of Enlightenment chaos. He's recalling us to what Hilaire Bloch said. The faith is Europe, and Europe is the faith. And he went on to say in the same address, in all honesty, one must observe that in the late Middle Ages we find trends in theology which would sunder this synthesis between the Greek spirit and the Christian spirit. And here we're moving closer toward an understanding of Americanism. Because we're talking here about what he is diplomatically describing as the revolt of Martin Luther, of course. Luther began these trends in theology, which resulted in the severance between the Greek spirit and the Christian spirit. Of course, Luther and all of his descendants hated the perennial philosophy. And they hated St. Thomas for that reason, because of that synthesis. They were fideists. Faith is one thing, reason's another. Now, Luther did what Machiavelli only dreamed of. He set in motion an actual rebellion on the ground against Catholic social order. And since Luther, we've seen two processes at work in Western civilization. The first is what Cornelio Fabreau has called the immanentization of the human mind, and the second is the atomization of political society, which at that time was the Christian Commonwealth in one form or another. Now, what does Fabreau mean by the immanentization of the human mind? He's talking about the word from the Latin meaning to remain within. And Fabreau traces in his monumental work this whole process of retreating from the world of being, which the synthesis between Greek thought and Christian theology made a part of the political philosophy of the church and the whole vision of society. Retreating from being as the beginning of knowledge into the mind as the beginning of knowledge. The thought process is the beginning of the search for truth, not the mind's conformity to what's out there. And so we see in these two processes, the immanentization of the mind and the atomization of political society, this whole trend of liberalism prescribing the cures for its own diseases. It's been going on since the time of Luther. And I want to talk about three of these cures today. The first cure is what Fabreau refers to, and others have referred to as the cogito of Descartes. Now, in his discourse on method, written in 1637, Descartes was writing about 100 years of chaos since Luther. People, as John said, were fed up with the chaos. All truth was called into doubt. Not just revealed truth, but even the natural law itself. And, of course, the so-called scientific advances were casting into doubt religious truth because of the false supposition that religious truth had to conform itself to empirical observation. People were obsessed with empirical observation, and they were doubting the truths of the faith because they couldn't be confirmed empirically. People were doubting everything. He was writing his discourse on method in the midst of a sea of doubt. And in the famous quote in Part 4, he says, and I'm quoting, "But I immediately realized that though I wanted to think that everything was false, it was necessary that the me who was doing the thinking was something. And noticing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain, and sure that all the wildest suppositions of skeptics could not shake it, I judged that I could unhesitatingly accept it as the first principle of the philosophy for which I was seeking." That's the Cartesian cogito. I think, therefore I am. And as the Jesuits would have told you at Fordham 30 or 40 years ago, the correct formulation is, I am, therefore I think. But he made thought the beginning of the search for knowledge. And he started that process of immanentization where we get locked in here and everything becomes a mental process. Theology becomes a thought process. Philosophy becomes a thought process. And we have what Fabreau called the indifferent neglect of being. We no longer care what's out there. We just begin with and we end up ending with what's in here. And that takes us to the second cure. The thought of Thomas Hobbes, which is leading us toward this whole idea of liberty, which is the problem of Americanism. Hobbes gives us the second cure. The absolute sovereign. We've had decade upon decade of chaos. Hobbes rushes in with his theory of the absolute sovereign. And consider the historical context in which he was writing his Leviathan in 1651. Charles I is overthrown in a regicide. They kill their king. They bring in Cromwell, who becomes a dictator. Cromwell falls. Charles II becomes king. They dig up Cromwell's body and posthumously execute it in 1660. Charles's brother James II has the temerity to convert to Roman Catholicism, so they have to get rid of him. They bring in the Rent-a-King, William of Orange, and stage the glorious revolution of 1688, which happened about 8 years after Hobbes' death. So that's the context in which he's writing. How do we handle this chaos? Descartes says, well, I think, therefore I am, that's all I know. And Hobbes says, well, we handle it with the absolute sovereign. We don't have a pope any longer to tell us what is true in matters of religion. And political authority is thrown into disarray by these Puritan revolutionaries. So we have a sovereign, one-stop shopping sovereign. He takes care of everything. Not only political truth, but religious truth. He will tell us what the canon of Scripture is. There go the King James Bible. And Hobbes claims to have invented political philosophy. C.B. McPherson says he's right. And in his commentary on Hobbes, he says that Hobbes was the first political philosopher to break away from the traditional reliance on a supposed will or purpose in the universe. And he was the first political philosopher to found a political philosophy on this anti-Greek position. That there is no purpose in the universe that we have to worry about. That we have to, as Johnson, take nature as it is. If nature is falling apart, that's the nature we work with. We don't worry about the ends of nature, the perfection of nature, the perfection of man as a natural being. This is nature. This is how we take it. We do what we can with that, and so we need the absolute sovereign. And so Hobbes, as Leo Strauss says in his commentary, invented political atheism. This is a total novelty in the Western tradition. There was no political atheism before Hobbes. You could argue maybe Machiavelli was the forerunner, but full-blown political atheism we find in Hobbes. And here's what Strauss, a Jewish scholar at the University of Chicago, says. Political atheism is a distinctly modern phenomenon. And as I will show you, Americanism is political atheism. No pre-modern atheist, he's looking about atheists before the modern era, no pre-modern atheist doubted that social life required belief in and worship of God or gods. If we do not permit ourselves to be deceived by ephemeral phenomena, we realize that political atheism and political hedonism belong together. They arose together in the same moment and in the same mind. meaning the mind of Thomas Hobbes. And Strauss's insight, which is Leo's insight, is that even atheists recognize that social life requires the corporate recognition of God because of what John has called the holistic vision of life that is the Western tradition. But for Hobbes, God is not the foundation of political philosophy, nor is he the foundation of rights. Rights don't come from God, but from man's need to maintain himself as a machine in motion. Men are machines. In a state of nature, they're warring with each other. And so this is kind of Newtonian analysis of political society. These machines in motion have to find a way to accommodate their motions to each other, so they take this absolute sovereign to impose order on the movements of all of the machines, which are all seeking to preserve themselves. And why is this? Because Protestants couldn't agree on anything any longer. We've had a century or more of chaos, and this was the solution. Cure number 2, so to speak. And so men who are brutes living in the state of nature, at war with each other, leave this state and they submit themselves to the absolute sovereign in order to escape what Hobbes called that perpetual and restless desire for power that ends only in death in the state of nature. And so the sovereign takes care of that problem for us. He gives us our Bible, he gives us our laws, he maintains peace among the warring machines, and that's the new notion of political society, which is political atheism. And natural law, as Strauss points out, and others have pointed out, is found not in man's end. Man is ordained to an end in God, and natural law guides him toward that end. No, it's the means of man's self-preservation. That and nothing more. There's a law of self-preservation. Man has the right to preserve himself in the state of nature. He can do whatever he pleases to preserve himself, but that becomes impossible. So we submit ourselves to the sovereign. We turn over to him the job of preserving ourselves from each other. And rights, therefore, lose their social character. In the Greek conception, the whole Western tradition, the exercise of rights is a social character. It's ordained toward the common good. There was no concept of an individual right. I've got mine and you've got yours. It was actually duties toward one's fellow man, toward the commonwealth, to which were attached correlative rights. We have the duty to safeguard peace in the commonwealth. Therefore, we have the right to this, that, and the other thing. We have the duty to achieve our highest end, which is God. Therefore, in the commonwealth, we have the right to worship God, not only individually but corporately. But the emphasis now has been reversed, and rights become the focus instead of duties with correlative rights attached. So virtue in society becomes reduced to peaceableness. I'm at peace with my fellow machine. He's running around pursuing what he wants, and I'm pursuing what I want. That molecule is fine, I'm fine, and we're peaceable. That's the end of society. Peaceableness and self-preservation become the ends of political society. And then the value of everything is determined by its ability to accommodate this competition between people. And then the value of people themselves becomes reduced to a calculation of what they are worth in this competition with each other. As Hobbes said, and I'm quoting, the value or worth of man as of all things is his price. And by that he means, what does it cost for me to buy the power that this man has over other men? What does it cost for me to buy the labor of that man, the power he has to produce, so that I can have it as my power? That's the value of this man to me, his price. So society becomes the adjustment of prices in a price structure, and men compete with each other for a certain price, and the function of government is to moderate this marketplace of men, and men become, as C.B. McPherson says, market men in a market society. And in the process, political society is no longer organized in any way out of a fear of those who can destroy the soul. As our Lord said, fear not those who can destroy the body, but who can destroy the body and the soul. We no longer fear those who can destroy the soul in the organization of political society. So political society doesn't take care of our souls with any kind of legislation or social institution that would protect the life of the spirit. Political society doesn't care about restraining those people any longer. It's a loss of the fear of invisible powers, as McPherson puts it. Which brings us to the third cure, leading to the sum total of these cures, which is Americanism. And I'm talking about the thought of John Locke. And specifically his two treatises on government in 1689. Locke is a kind of new and improved Hobbes, the kinder, gentler Hobbes. But he's really, in the end, preaching the same thing as Hobbes. John talked about two forms of the tyranny of Enlightenment-style social order. Regalism on the one hand and separationism on the other hand. Hobbes would be the regalist. He wanted to unify the church and state in the sovereign. The sovereign is the church. Locke is the separationist. He wants to separate the two powers. Voltaire, Jefferson, Madison, the other founders, they all took their cue from John Locke. And Locke tries to argue that man is wholly rational and peaceable by nature. And scholars would argue that he distinguishes his state of nature from Hobbes' state of nature. But it really isn't so. In the end, Locke says the same thing. He says men have to escape from this state of nature because they're warring with each other. And so they need to escape from it in order to protect not their souls, not to pursue their final end, but to get security for their property. So they surrender their liberty in the state of nature under the law of nature, which, as in the thought of Hobbes, is the law of self-preservation. In the state of nature, we can all fight to preserve ourselves. We're all the executors of the law of nature and state of nature. We surrender our power to execute the law of nature to an elected sovereign. Not the absolute sovereign of Hobbes, but the elected sovereign, who then allows us to turn over to him the execution of the law of nature. The new elected sovereign will preserve us from each other and will carry out the great law of nature, which is self-preservation. But in the end, Locke's elected sovereign is the Hobbesian sovereign. Because Locke himself says the legislative authority in his society is supreme, and that we consent to it not only explicitly by voting for it, but tacitly by partaking of the benefits of the Commonwealth. He says in the two treatises, the second treatise specifically, that the tacit consent we give to this supreme legislative authority is that we partake of the benefits of life in the Commonwealth. We own property, we benefit from its laws. So if you hang around in the Commonwealth, you've consented to its supreme authority. And that consent, says Locke, is irrevocable. You irrevocably consent to this elected sovereign that you supposedly consented to. And they were all hung up, the Protestant thinkers on government, with title to government. They were obsessed with this idea of consent, but the idea of consent becomes a fiction. Locke says consent is tacit, consent is by a vote, and that vote stands for the will of all if it's the consent of the majority, 50% plus 1. But that's completely arbitrary, of course. Well, why should 50% plus 1 bound the remaining 49%? It's a fiction. The Catholic view of authority is not that it derives from consent. That's more or less irrelevant. How title to authority is acquired doesn't matter in the Catholic or even in the Hellenistic conception. The Catholic conception is that authority comes from God. So if it's a king who comes in and occupies a territory by conquest, and no one has consented to this king, but no one attempts to overthrow him either, that king, by prescription at least, acquires the divine authority. I have authority over my children, not because I'm the father, but because God says, as part of the natural law, that fathers have authority over their children. All exercise of authority in the family, in society, comes from God. Consent is just a designation of who exercises that authority. Locke obliterates this distinction and ends up saying, although it's a gratuitous observation, that the authority itself derives from consent. And then he goes on to show that consent is more or less irrelevant anyway. We end up with an absolute sovereign, the supreme legislative authority. But the key thing is that the proper concept of authority, regardless of the title to authority, is lost. It's no longer understood that all exercises of authority come from God and must conform to the divine law as well as the natural law. Now, Locke tried to defend Christianity, shattered into 1,000 pieces, on the grounds of reason. But in the end, he retreats from this, and he comes up with a political philosophy based on a so-called religion of common sense, which turns out to be a religion of 1,000 opinions. And as for Reveal's religion, he deals with that in his letter on toleration and elsewhere. And basically, he promulgates what he calls the law of toleration. And the law of toleration, stated basically by Locke himself, is this: every man is orthodox to himself, every church is orthodox to itself. And so we must find a way to accommodate these 1,000 different orthodoxies in political society. And that's the law of toleration. That's cure number 3. Society is shattered into 1,000 pieces. What do we do about it? Liberalism has caused the problem. Here's liberalism's solution. from the essay on toleration. People, therefore, that are shattered into different factions are best secured by toleration. So, liberalism has destroyed the unity of Catholic social order. Society is shattered into factions. Liberalism rushes in with the cure of the law of toleration. And the law of toleration is the foundation stone of the Americanist way of thinking. Because the law of toleration basically says, we don't know the truth, this is what we'll do. We'll tolerate all shades of opinion. And there will be a law of toleration. Not just an opinion that there should be toleration, but a law of toleration which assumes the status of a religious dogma. Craycraft, in his whole study of the myth of American religious liberty, points out, beyond any serious argument, that the law of toleration is nothing other than a supreme religious dogma. That Locke is disguising his theological judgment as a principle of political accommodation. But what Locke is really saying is that revealed truth on many points is impossible to know. He has determined this and has decreed that since we don't know the full content of revelation, and we'll never know it with any certitude, we must have the law of toleration, and all cults within a political society must incorporate that law of toleration into their religious creeds if they want to be respected and tolerated in political society themselves. And so in his letter on toleration, he says for that very reason, Catholics should not be extended the benefit of the law of toleration. Because papists, as he says, are always looking to establish this Christian commonwealth, which of course would void the law of toleration. Various measures would be enacted to restrict the public activities of heretics, and the Catholics are always seeking to do this, and so they are not to be extended the benefits of toleration. There's just too many disagreements over God, so let's leave God out of the constitution of political society, and let's leave the papists out of it as well, unless they adapt themselves to the state. In his essay on toleration, written to the Lord Shaftesbury, not to be distinguished from the letter on toleration, he says, well, what we can do with Catholics is this. We can enlist them in the defense of the realm. And if we enlist them in the defense of the realm and we keep them busy defending the realm from domestic and foreign enemies, maybe they'll become friends of the state, even if they're not sons of the church, meaning the Church of England. And that's the strategy which has ultimately proven successful. And Catholics get the benefit of the law of toleration because they become friends of the realm. Now, for Locke, when all is said and done, just as it is with Hobbes, the so-called law of nature, we always hear about Locke's natural law doctrine and how America is founded on natural law doctrine. His law of nature is really no different from Hobbes' law of nature, which is the self-preservation of each individual. The great law of nature is that we have the right to defend ourselves against aggression from others. People who want to take our stuff or take our lives, we, in the state of nature, can kill them. Now, in the state that we've consented to, political authority can kill the aggressor. And our consent to that arrangement, as I've pointed out, is irrevocable once we take the benefits of that arrangement. And Locke also added to Hobbes his particular emphasis on the property right. For Locke, the great end of political society is the preservation of property. When we leave the state of nature to defend ourselves, what are we defending? We're defending our bodies, we're defending our possessions against invaders. So the whole basis of political society for Locke, the great end for which it was organized, is the preservation of our property. And on this theory, as McPherson and others point out, especially with the advent of money, in political society you can justify the unlimited acquisition of wealth. Because of money, we're no longer subject to the law of waste, where in Locke says in the state of nature, if you take more than you can use and you waste it, you've committed a wrong. Thanks to the advent of money, we can buy units representing the value of things, and we can hoard infinite amounts of money, which are units of buying power that allow us to acquire things later on as we need them or don't need them. I mean, also, we can accumulate capital and build huge industries and hire thousands of day laborers. And there's no limit to wealth in that society. And of course, here the duty of charity within the Western tradition, recognizing that society is a moral totality created to defend and protect the common good, is completely lost. Society dissolves into the pursuit of individual interests, the unlimited acquisition of wealth. But Locke has the answer here too. He says, well, this can be justified morally because the day laborer in an industrial society is better off than even the king of the Indians in America. So we see here already the foundation stone of the Americanist ethic, the ethic of all modern political societies, which is consequentialism. That's the theory that says A can take advantage of B in the most shameful way imaginable, but it doesn't matter, because when you add up all of the consequences of his exploitation, in the end, more people benefit from it than are hurt by it. Well, yes, B is hurt by being enslaved for a pittance, working 16 hours a day in a factory. He is indeed a wage slave. But when you add up the sum total of the benefits of this new economic order, well, even the wage slave is better off than the Indian king, and all of the wage slaves are better off than the Indian kings. So although the arrangement between A and B at the level of commutative justice is immoral, in terms of distributive justice, it's moral because the sum total of the benefits outweigh the wrong done to the individual. And that's just immoral. The Church teaches against consequentialist ethics, which is a facet of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, as Bentham put it. But that's the foundation stone of the ethic of modern political societies. The greatest good for the greatest number of people. And what about the pursuit of happiness in this society? Well, Locke, joining all of his forebears, and every liberal since, says that the Greek philosophers, sought for this idea of happiness in vain, as he put it. Happiness is whatever a man thinks makes him happy. As Locke says, it's, and I'm quoting, having those things which produce the greatest pleasures. End quote. So happiness is whatever floats your boat. That's the new conception of happiness. It's a hedonic utilitarian ethic. And Strauss describes this brilliantly in his study of Locke, the great natural right theorist, we're told, who provided the foundation stones for American society. Here's what he says about the society that Locke and all the thinkers since him have given us. The painful hedonism becomes utilitarianism, or political hedonism. The painful relief of pain culminates not so much in the greatest pleasures as in having those things which produce the greatest pleasures. Life is the joyless quest for joy. So what we have is the joyless quest for joy. That is American life. That is life in modern political society. And as John pointed out in his talk, all of this presupposes that nature is taken as it is. Fallen man is taken as a given. As John said, man can do nothing with nature. For Locke and Hobbes, for the whole political philosophy that underlies this republic and all similar political arrangements, the fall and its consequences have no place. Original sin is taken as a given, and so the end of political society is to accommodate men in their sin. And liberty becomes not an end by which man is perfected in virtue, by which he rises above his fallen nature and achieves the state of sanctifying grace. No, liberty becomes an end in itself. Liberty is simply the right of each man to be free of interference by other men, and so society exists not for the perfection of man in virtue, but for the adjudication of disputes between men, each of whom will do whatever he pleases. So that liberty comes to mean nothing more than the protection of individual rights, and individual rights means nothing more in the end than doing whatever we want. And that brings us to the meaning of Americanism. The problem with Americanism is that it adulates a state, a republic, which is, in fact, the first fully functional Lockean state. It idolizes America as the incarnation of liberalism. Now, when I say it idolizes America, I'm not talking about the fatherland. Mike mentioned our natural obligation to practice the virtue of patriotism. Patriotism is a love of the fatherland, but it is not a love of political principles, political parties, or political arrangements of any kind. We love our fatherland. We don't love the principles which have produced our current situation. And the principles we're talking about amount to the first fully functional Lockean state. And the Americanist idea is that this, as John suggested in his talk, is all divinely ordained. There's been a stately progression of man through the centuries, and finally, because of his eventual illumination from on high, man has discovered the proper arrangement of things, and that arrangement has incarnated itself in America. John Adams put it this way: thus was human nature chained fast for ages in a cruel, shameful, and deplorable servitude to him, him meaning the Pope, and his subordinate tyrants, who it was foretold would exalt himself above all that was called God and that was worshipped. Thus, as long as this confederacy lasted, i.e. the Catholic Church in the Christian state, as long as this confederacy lasted and the people were held in ignorance, liberty, with her knowledge and virtue too, seemed to have deserted the earth, and one age of darkness succeeded another, till God in his benign providence raised up the champions who began and conducted the Reformation. So the whole idea behind the American Republic in the minds of the founders is that it was the culmination of an historical process of enlightenment and liberation from the claims of the Catholic Church. And liberalism as a whole is precisely the attempt to delegitimate the political claims of the Catholic Church. And the Americanists bought the whole enchilada. They were quite willing to agree that the American Republic represented precisely this new stage in the evolution of mankind. You don't have to go any further than the speeches of Bishop Ireland, which I've had the distinctive pleasure to have read every one of. First of all, Ireland, and he spoke for the entire Americanist faction when he said this, accepted the Lockean notion, this total departure from the Hellenized Christian vision of society, that civil power exists only for the purpose of the preservation of individual rights. Speaking in 1884 at the Baltimore Cathedral, he said, "If civil power is from God, it is to be used for purposes intended by God. The preservation of society, the defense of the rights of individuals and families. Beyond those purposes, rulers have no jurisdiction." So here he is openly and publicly stating that God himself has ordained the limitation of political society to the protection of individual rights, and that rulers have no jurisdiction beyond this. So basically he consents, and the Americanists all consent, to the destruction of the holistic vision of life. You heard that song 20 years ago, 21st Century Schizoid Man? That's what we're talking about. The schizoid man who consents to the division of his body from his soul and his public life from his private life. This is the 21st century schizoid man, and they were celebrating him in the 19th century in the progressive era, when the Americanists were in their ascendancy. Now, Bishop Ireland, like John Adams, spoke of liberty in terms of a deity. Here's what he said in one of his speeches. He said that the spirit of democracy was hovering over the nations, seeking to incarnate itself in a people capable of its sublime life. 4 years later, he spoke of the spirit of liberty incarnate, his very words, which before that time was, and I'm quoting, a creature of the skies, something too ethereal to make its home on earth, end quote. And then he went on to say that the spirit of liberty now and then seemed to come near, more radiant in form, and men were hoping it was about to abide with them. They heard the whisper of its voice. They touched the hem of its garment, but again it would flee their embrace and return to the skies. This is a Catholic prelate of the first rank, speaking of liberty in these terms. And then with the passing of ages, says Ireland, men's souls were waxing stronger. This is an echo of John Adams. More and more they were being leavened by the teachings of the prophet of Galilee, so that finally democracy was in truth passing over peoples, seeking a dwelling place on earth. I mean, he went beyond John Adams in his adulation of the Republic as a veritable incarnation of liberty. And in his study of the Jeffersonian vision of America, Connor Cruz O'Brien describes his whole vision as an absolute and deified liberty incarnate in the American and French Revolution. And here is the leading American prelate of his time, next to Cardinal Gibbons, promoting that very thing. And he went on to say in another speech that liberty is a fair goddess. He calls liberty a fair goddess that is ensconced in the bark of the American Republic sailing forth into the world, protected by this bark. And so we have nothing less than open idolatry of the American Republic as a goddess, as an idol. He even called it an idol in one of his speeches. It's a rhetorical point, but he was half serious. And so what is it that we say when we say that there is such a thing as an Americanist heresy? We say, as I said at the beginning of the speech, that it's anything but a phantom heresy. It's got flesh and bones. And the features of it are basically, first of all, a reconciliation totally of the church to liberalism. If you read the speeches of the Americanists, whether it be Ireland or O'Donnell or Father Hecker, they all say the same thing. It's time for us to reconcile ourselves to the modern age. And Ireland says repeatedly, we must ignore these Catholic reactionaries who think they are the only true Catholics. And in a strange parallel with the Second Vatican Council and the conciliar popes, Ireland says, who are these Catholics who consider themselves the only true Catholics? Oh, will they not follow Pope Leo, the prophet of the age? It's almost as if he's talking about John Paul the Great. And even then, traditionalists were being denounced for their reaction. The only problem with Ireland's position is that his position was contrary to the position of the popes, and the pope was on the side of the traditionalists of the day, as we see in the Syllabus of Errors. And the second characteristic is, of course, the separation of church and state. The Americanists loved it. They praised it to the heavens. John made the point that we can tolerate it. But when you tolerate it, it becomes psychologically impossible, not ultimately to say that it's a positive good. And the Americanists did not hesitate to say that. It was a positive good. And the third characteristic is that man is free to pursue whatever religion reason tells him is the true religion. That's the Lockean law of toleration. The Americanists were all in favor of it. And of course they were in favor of the strict legal equality of all religions. They defended this again and again, even though it leads, as Leo pointed out, to the destruction of all religion in society eventually. And of course, they subscribe to the Lockean idea of liberty as self-ownership and the right to do as one pleases as long as one respects the rights of others. Ireland champions that in speeches. I could give you quotes, but I don't want to spend 2 hours here. And finally, as I've noted, that America is the crown of human evolution. And that only one republic in the world has true liberty. The whole concept of liberty has been distorted to the point where we had no liberty before 1776. Man had no conception of liberty before the fair goddess descended to earth and incarnated herself in the Declaration of Independence. This is an American prelate and his fellow Americanists taking this position. And progress, said Ireland in speech after speech, is God's will. We see the melioristic strain of Americanist thought. This frankly heretical notion that happiness and goodness must increase in the world. That it's God's law that happiness and goodness increase on a natural level. Again, a total disregard of the fallen state of man and the consequences of original sin, and the means of sanctifying grace is the only way that man can be elevated and achieve any measure of happiness in this world. The Americans posited a law of progress. And America was the embodiment of the operation of that law. And the next feature, to make sure everyone is imbued with this understanding of how precious the goddess of liberty is, we must have universal public education. Ireland was all in favor of the public educational system. He wanted Catholic education to be tacked on to the end of the school day. But if he had had his way, he would have abolished the Catholic school system and added some Catholic instruction to the end of the school day. He was denounced as the Antichrist of the North for that particular opinion. And finally, as John pointed out, if we have to, said the Americanists, we must make war throughout the world to spread this notion of liberty throughout the world. Because God has ordained it. It's the law of progress. Man has finally reached the level of human evolution where it's obvious that this is what he was meant to do, to erect a society of this sort, a pluralistic society organized according to the law of toleration. This is the divinely ordered state of things, so there must be a crusade, as John pointed out. The new Christian king, the King of America, who calls himself a president, must take this crusade throughout the world by means of war if necessary. So you find the Americanists supporting the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, which destroyed Catholic social order and slaughtered 250,000 to 1 million Filipinos, the liberation of Cuba, and the turning over of Cuba and the Philippines to Masonic revolutionaries by American presidents. Now, the great smoking gun text on this, from the Americanist perspective, the one that sums up this whole attitude of the Americanists, which afflicts us today, is Dennis O'Connell's letter to Bishop Ireland just before the Spanish-American War began. He said that this war, and I'm quoting, is a question of two civilizations. It is a question of all that is old and vile and mean and rotten and cruel and false in Europe, and all that is noble and free and open and true and humane in America. When Spain is swept off the seas, much of the meanness and narrowness of old Europe goes with it, to be replaced by the freedom and openness of America. This is God's way of developing the world, and all continental Europe feels the war is against itself. And that is why they are all against us. And Rome more than all. So here's O'Donnell writing to Ireland saying, Rome is against us more than all, and Rome was against them. That's what the syllabus was about. That's what the encyclicals of Leo XIII were all about. And the Americanists resolutely ignored all of these papal pronouncements. They pretended that Leo was the Pope of the age. They pretended the syllabus didn't exist. Which brings us to the problem of Americanism today. Because the Americanists within the church today still see it necessary that America wage war for liberty throughout the world. And this war in Iraq, this absolute debacle, worse even than the remnant imagined 3 months before it began, this war is the Hobbesian sovereign of today, disguising himself as the Lockean consensual sovereign, molding us, as John said, molding